You know how there's certain days when you're singing, it just resonates with you? I'm already good. I don't even need to speak. I can just go home. That was fantastic. Well, welcome. It is good to see all of you here this morning. I am glad you are here, and we want to dig into the next part in our series. But before we do, a couple of things that I wanted to announce or talk about. Number one is, by the way, for if you're a life group leader, we have our leaders meeting after church today down in the fireside room. So come on and be a part of that. We'll do that for a little bit, about an hour after the service, because life groups have been going on for about 2 months now, to a whole bunch of different experiences and reactions. But I think it's fantastic. So if you're not in one, you're missing out, and we'd love to have you a part of one. So that's one. Number two is, if you have not downloaded the ARAC app yet on your phone, I would highly suggest that you do that, because it's our best way to not only see what's been going on, see the video blogs, all the different things that happen, but it's a great way to do that. We are rapidly approaching Thanksgiving, Christmas, and all the fun stuff that has to do with that. So I'm hopeful that you're going to have a great time. We're going to announce a couple things that are coming up in that in the weeks to come. But this week is Veterans Day. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least recognize and pray for those who have served in our country. And you have to understand, I grew up in Canada. We have a military of about 6 people, so we really didn't care a whole lot about this kind of thing. So I came down to the U.S. and found out that every family seemed to have a veteran or someone who served, and so I realized it was a much bigger deal here. But the reason I think it's such an appropriate day today is it's a reminder, because we always talk about the sacrifice that people gave and the veterans that served. And we get to celebrate the Lord's table today, which is the ultimate sacrifice on the behalf of other people. And so will you just join me? I want to pray specifically for that group of people in our country this morning. Father, we are grateful because you have hardwired into who we are, in a lot of ways, this desire for something bigger, this desire to serve, the desire that steps outside of our sinful selfishness, that wants to do something for the good of other people. And those who serve in the military have taken that to the highest level because they've actually put their very life on the line on the behalf of other people. A lot of times what they get out of it is not what we do or what we celebrate today. So even in the midst of a country that's fractured, a country that's at odds with itself, that many of us feel is going down the wrong path, we still have the freedoms we do, and we enjoy what you have blessed us with because, in large part, of the sacrifice of others. So will you make yourself real to the families, to the veterans themselves, to the people who are in their lives? That as they deal with the aftermath, as they continue to serve and all those things, that your Holy Spirit is as deeply in love with them as anybody, and that you would make yourself real to each and every one of them. And that they would draw the connection between their own sacrifice and their own service to your sacrifice and your service. So give us an eye to see and a mouth to encourage, and the hands to help those of us or those around us that we celebrate this week. So we ask all these things in the name of your Son. Amen. Well, we are in week 2 of our teaching series called A Tale of Three Kings. And as you see up here, the subtitle is Authority, Submission, and Trusting God's Plan. And it's we've said by looking at the story of the first 3 kings of Israel, which was Saul, David, and Absalom. We're going to take a look at those first. And Absalom's an interesting choice because he was sort of king and sort of not. We're going to talk about that later. And in the early life of the kingdom of Israel, we're going to see that they followed, they led, they trusted very differently in their years of service. And what we saw last week, and the theme that's going to carry us through this entire series, that God is primarily interested in our inner transformation. Much more so than a lot of the stuff we see on the outside, the stuff we put so much value on. God cares about our inner transformation. Now, here's the funny part. That's what you guys all care about too. And I know that's true because when you look at your kids, what are you most concerned about? Who they're becoming. When you serve under a boss, what kind of boss do you want? A boss that gets it, whose character matches, right, what you want to see. When you deal with when you're looking for a spouse, what are you looking for? You're looking for someone whose character matches up, who's transformed, who's growing in their inner self. It's what we hope for in our leaders. It's what we wish for in our government. I mean, we celebrate people when they change and when they reform and when they become someone new. We celebrate that even if their past was messed up. So that's what we want till it's us. And they were like, oh, yeah, I know. I want to transform, I want to grow, but I really don't want it to take any effort. I just want it to happen. So we fight it. And so last week, I left you with homework and a question. Your homework was to read through the life of Saul, as found in the book of 1 Samuel, starting around chapter 9. Some of you have been doing that. I hope you have, because you get to read some of the very interesting things that are happening. And then, as you did that, I had you to ask this question, which is, what am I most interested in then? If that's the purpose, if that's what we're going to be talking about for 6 weeks, what am I most interested in? Am I really interested in being innerly transformed, right? Or am I more interested in, yeah, I want to be transformed, but I really want to see God fix my circumstances, use me, and do all these things over here instead, right? Where are you at? And it's very easy, by the way, when we get older to think, I'm as fully transformed as I'm going to get. Which, just talk to your spouse or your significant other, and they'll tell you that's not true, okay? So what we saw, this is the question, I kind of want you to kind of live with this for the next 5 weeks. And what we saw last week was that Saul, the first king of Israel, life started well. Do you remember the story, right? He was anointed, he was empowered, God used him, he did some amazing things, he was a good king, and he did all kinds of things. He had growing popularity, he pulled this whole kingdom together. The very first time there'd ever been a kingdom, he pulled that all together, and then it ended poorly. And over the course of his life, from where he started way up here to where he ended way down here, there was this long slide into something that was not good because there was no inner transformation. So what happened? What stopped it? What kept Saul from staying where God started and actually having an upward trajectory of inner transformation as opposed to a downward one? And I'm sure there were lots of reasons, but there's one that sticks out. A reason that derailed him and is derailing a lot of you and has derailed me. And it's simply this. Fear. Now, you've all heard stories about what people fear the most, right? You've all heard these, you've Google searched them, or you've heard someone talk about this before. You've probably heard pastors talk about this before. We say, what is your greatest fear? And we talk about, and they do surveys on this. And you remember what the number one is? Public speaking. That's right. Most people would rather die than public speak. So lest you think this is easy for me, I'm scared. People don't think I'm still nervous. It's true. Public speaking. And there's other ones that always seem to pop up into this list, and you'll talk about it. There's the fear of heights, which is really the fear of falling, not really the fear of heights. Right? There's the fear of closed spaces, claustrophobia. Ironically, the dream I had just before I woke up today, I was in an elevator that literally had room for 3 people. And I still remember this because in my dream I thought, why is it not opening? I'm starting to feel claustrophobic. I was asleep. Anyway. And then there's a fear that a lot of people have that if you ever had kids, you've experienced. Now, if you ever had kids or grandkids, you remember how they all had lots of these, right? Animals, okay? So they would have a wildebeest. Yeah, that's kind of cool, and you'd play with that. They might have a tiger, and that would be good too. And if the kids, like roar, they got the dinosaur. You can tell I have grandkids because I still have these in the house, right? Or they'd have the alligator, and you're like, that's cool. No big deal. Until they pull out the spiders. And I had a friend who hated spiders. And so you know what his kids did? They put them around the house. Wherever it would shock him. And they would put them, or they'd sneak up behind him and they'd put it right here, and all of a sudden he would notice it, right? And he would freak out. And the kids thought that was the funniest thing ever, right? Fear of spiders, right? And there's some of you right now that if I threw this to you, you'd be like, woo, leave this away, right? Not those things, these things. Well, that's not the kind of fear we're talking about today. Okay? Just let's get that out of the way, and I'm going to move these off the Lord's table so we don't have a wildebeest looking at the elements. All right. Okay? That's not the kind of fear we're talking about. We rarely, let's be honest, we kind of say, what do you fear the most? Oh, I fear, heights. Okay, but most of us don't lay in bed awake worrying about falling from somewhere high. We're not unable to sleep at night because we're worried that there's a spider in the room. Some people do. Most people not. Right? And we're not spending our time obsessing over public speaking unless we happen to be doing it the next day. We're probably not sharing prayer requests about being in an elevator that wouldn't open. But the things that keep us up and the fears that we're talking about this morning are those things, those anxious thoughts, those things that occupy our mind. They keep us awake. They're the things we're always begging God for. We want Him to help us with that. What are those things? Because they begin to take our waking hours and our thought energy, and it's what we obsess about. And it doesn't even have to be logical. There was a time, and I think I've told you this story. See, you're married 30 years. I'm not even sure. There was a time when I was a teenager, I'm not sure I ever told the story to my wife, where, and I don't know why, if it was what the books I was reading or what, because I like to read Revelation, but I had these pictures of being arrested and tortured and killed for my faith, which isn't a big deal, except that I began to obsess about it. I began to think about it all the time. It got to the point where I didn't like to be alone in the middle of the day because I couldn't get away from it. I was scared. And it wasn't until I sat down with my father, and he was very wise, and he kind of walked me through it, and it kind of ended that. But I would wager that the vast majority of you have something that worries you. And here's why I know that. About a month ago, we had an exercise where we asked God for freedom from something and freedom to do something. And if you were here, you remember we had 2 boards on the other side, and you put up and you wrote on a sticky note, and you put it up on the page as we took our communion. And do you know what the number one thing that we wrote together was? Worry. Anxiety. Fear. All kinds of things. It's those decisions on how we interact with people, how they're going to respond to us, what's going to happen with our money, how we use our time, all those things, these fears, and how we think about all those things, these fears shape how we do all these things. They shape how we use our time. They'll shape how you use your money this week. They'll shape what you say in conversation. They're going to shape whether or not you go to a life group. They're going to shape whether or not you stay home. They're going to shape how you deal with your boss. They're going to shape what you do with your neighbors. Every one of those is affected by and impacted by, or can be, by fear. Now, you're smart people. You know all this. This isn't new information, and yet this still seems to have this hold on us that we can't get away from. And so, by examining Saul today, I hope we can identify this a little more clearly and maybe see or cooperate with God in a way that transforms us and begins to deal with this. Well, when we, and see, those aren't the things. We're not talking about those things this morning. Well, it wasn't very far into Saul's reign that things began to go south. Started good. There were some really neat things that happened in those first couple of years. But it all began when his son Jonathan, okay, so this is a little ways in, he's got a son, young guy, but he took part of the army, and they attacked a Philistine outpost. And if you read through the story of Saul, you're going to see the Philistines come up a lot. It was a people group that was near Israel, was a thorn in their side. And so his son took part of the army, and they went and attacked this outpost at Gibeah, which used to be part of Israel, so they're basically taking land back. But this caused the Philistine army to say, hey, what is going on here? And they mobilized their army. There was this great threat under this new king Saul. And they're like, okay, we got to do something about this. So the Philistines mobilized this whole army. They're more powerful. They're more numerous. They have better weapons. And so the Israelite army just begins to melt away. Guys are like, I'm going home. Like, I don't need this. And the people that stayed around, they hid in pits in the ground, in water cisterns. They would hide in caves. I mean, they didn't want to be found. They were terrified. The army begins to melt away. And so Saul does this whole, he's so fearful, he's so worried that the army's deserting that he does this rash thing where he runs ahead of Samuel, offers a sacrifice when he wasn't supposed to. He took the office of priest, basically, where he wasn't allowed to do that, trying to manipulate God's blessing. And when Samuel shows up, he challenges Saul. He says, look, you've been foolish. If you'd been listening, if you'd been obedient, if you'd done what I asked you to do, I would have established your kingdom for a long time, but now I'm looking for someone else to be king. It was kind of like the trigger event. But that's not the event I want to look at this morning. There's another one that happened a little bit later, because God wasn't done with Saul. He still wanted to use him. He still wanted to use him to enact his plan. But it's like the trajectory had changed. And then we come on this event in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And I want to read it. Let's kind of go through it, and then we'll unpack it a little bit. Samuel said to Saul, so in other words, the prophet Samuel, he comes to Saul, and he says, I am the one that the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people. In other words, do you remember the story? Do you remember how you were looking for your donkey and I found you? I mean, God sent me to do that. So now I want you to listen, because I talk for the Lord. I want you to listen to this message. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites, we'll talk about them in a second, for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now, go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys. And this is one of those verses that we hate, because it sounds awful. So you have to understand there's a little history behind here. The Amalekites were a nation that when Israel came out of Egypt, you remember this? Way, way long before. And all they were trying to do was get from Egypt to the promised land. And what they typically did, if you read through the story, was they said, look, we have our own food, our own provisions. We just want permission to go through your territory to get where we're going. We're not going to take anything. We're not going to do anything. We just want to make sure that we're all okay. And most kingdoms were good with that, but not the Amalekites. The Amalekites actually came out and tried to destroy Israel. And God, at the time, said, and they won a victory, and it was very miraculous, and God said, there will be a time when they will be judged for this. And it is now 400 years later. And the Amalekites have had 400 years to change, to turn to God, to amend their ways. And instead, they've gotten increasingly wicked, increasingly distant. I mean, they were just an evil, wicked nation. God says, all right, time's up. And now you're going to be wiped off the face of the earth. And I'm going to use Saul to do this. Now, Saul knew all this history. He was a good Israelite. He'd heard the stories. He remembered what had happened. He knew that this was what God was going to do. And so he had his marching orders, and so he attacked them, just like God told him, and he destroyed them. Mostly. Here's what we read. After the battle, it says, but Saul and the army spared Agag, who was the king, the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and cattle and the fat calves and the lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. God's not happy with Saul. And the word of the Lord came to Samuel, and he said, I regret that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and not carried out my instructions. And Samuel was angry. It doesn't say who he was angry with, but he was angry. And he cried out to the Lord all night, sleepless night. Now, quick word here. Okay? I don't know what translation you're reading. Some of the translations here, when he says here, I regret that I have made Saul king, the translations you might have might says, I repented of making Saul king. There's this idea that God's like, oops, picked the wrong guy, made a mistake, I'm moving the other direction. That's not the sense of the word here. God doesn't make mistakes. He didn't have all of a sudden new information. It wasn't like we do a decision where we make a decision and later we find out more and we're like, oh, I regret that I did that because now I know this. That wasn't true. God had all the information from the beginning. So when you read this, it just means that God is expressing now a different attitude about something that he expressed before, because, not because the turn of events was unexpected, but that made it more fitting now to express this issue than he had before. That's really what God is saying. He's saying, look, I knew this was going to happen. But all this has come about, and so now I can tell you this was not the best for Israel because I have someone else. So Samuel doesn't get any sleep that night because he knows he's got to go face the king the next day. And so the next day he did. And when Samuel reached him, I love this conversation, Saul said, I can just picture Saul going, Lord bless you, Samuel, it's good to see you. Look, I've carried out the Lord's instructions. And he's all happy. He's like, look at me, look what I've done. Men are all happy. Everybody's celebrating. And I wonder, I wish I was there to see how he said it, but he's like, so what's the bleating of sheep that I'm hearing in my ears? What's this? The lowing of the cattle that I hear. And you can see Saul is like, oh. Saul answered, well, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. And he can't get any farther, and Samuel interrupts his little speech. Enough, Samuel says to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And I don't know. When I first read this, I'm like, Saul's like, tell me. But I wonder if it's like, okay. Tell me, what did God say? Samuel said, although you were once small in your own eyes. Remember, he didn't even think much of himself. Did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? You became king. The Lord anointed you king over Israel. He sent you on a mission saying, go and completely destroy these wicked people, the Amalekites. Again, you see a clue in there. This is a wicked people. This is not just an innocent group of people. Wage war against them until you've wiped them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord? But I did. I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission. The Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. I brought back Agag, their king. And the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best, and what was devoted to God in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And you're all very familiar with this verse because it gets used all the time. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of lambs. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. That should terrify us, by the way, because what it basically is saying is, when you are proud, that's as bad as worshiping idols, or similar to. Interesting. But, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. There's kind of an air of finality in what Samuel says, and I think Saul could hear it. And finally, Saul comes clean. He hasn't been fully transparent up till now, but he kind of hears the death knell for his term as king, and it's like he panics, and he blurts out what really went on. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. And now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. And Saul replied, I've sinned. Okay? His moment of transparency is over. Look what he says. I've sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me. In other words, I don't want to lose face, so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Now, crazy story. Really interesting to me. What does this all have to do with fear? And as I read through this, I see a couple things that I want to unpack a little bit. Because here's the first one. Do you know that when we have fear, it's always connected to significant desires in our life? That's fear. Again, I'm not talking about the fear of falling off of a cliff. I mean, obviously our desire is not to die. That's not what I'm talking about here. This fear is always attached to significant desires. What do you think Saul's biggest fears were? That's what people thought of him, wasn't it? His biggest fear was what other people thought of who he was. One of them, he stated it very clearly, and it drove a lot of what he did, which is fear of people. I've sinned, I violated the Lord's command, I was afraid of the men, so I gave in to them. See, despite his anointing, despite the fact that God had put him in that place, Saul was completely insecure about his position as king. He was insecure about it. The men, in this case, had desires that were contrary to Saul's orders, and so he acquiesced. He said, all right, I know we were supposed to do this, and I can just picture that. You can see the conversations. They're destroying things, and guys are coming back going, Saul, this stuff's really awesome. I mean, yeah, we did all that over here, but we weren't sure. I mean, look at this. These cattle are prime. I mean, this stuff is awesome. This is going to make us more rich, you know? Let's not do that. I mean, God couldn't really have meant that. He must have meant this. And you can see these conversations happening. Probably pretty intense. The guys are pretty amped up. They've just been in battle, still in battle. I mean, they're not really passive right now. There's a lot of testosterone going on. And so Saul says, okay, go ahead. And even when Samuel comes back, his whole rationale is you got to honor me in front of people because the people have to see me well. Because Saul wants to be seen as king. He wants to be affirmed. He wants to be built up. He wants to be listened to. In fact, he gets fearful later, and we're going to see this in his kingship when David is loved more than he is. And it's not even like David's loved and Saul's hated. It's just that David's loved more. He's so insecure. Fear is always connected to significant desires. But here's the truth, okay? Underlying desires are rarely the problem. So the issue is not these significant desires. What we want is almost always the overflow of something good. I mean, that's just what it is. There's nothing wrong with the desires. We want to be secure. We want to have enough. That's okay, right? We want to have good relationships with people that love us. That's fantastic. God's actually wired that into us. We want to be successful. We want to have our children follow after God. That's a great desire. We want to gain victory over the enemy, right? Whether it's Satan or other people that are evil. We want to increase our influence. None of those desires are wrong. So the reason I'm bringing this up is not because you need to stop having desires or stop caring about those desires. I'm not trying to shut that down or shut off our emotions. That's not the key here. But fear comes when those desires are threatened. That's when fear comes in. And what's crazy is it doesn't even have to be a real threat for us to act this way. There's a very famous poem by Tennyson called The Charge of the Light Brigade. You all heard of that? Do you all know the story behind that? It's a crazy story. If you read the poem or listen to it, it sounds very inspiring, right? The men charging on their horses, charging down the enemy, which was the Russians at the time in the 1800s. It was actually an actual series of events that it was written about. But the actual events were simply a British commander who was worried and threatened because no one had ever taken his guns before. And he was worried and felt threatened that the Russians were going to do that. And so through a whole series of events, he ends up getting his cavalry to charge into the teeth of the Russian artillery. And they were obliterated. They had like 30% casualties, like 50% of the horses were killed. It was a disaster. It wasn't noble at all. It was all based on someone who's fearful and threatened. The things that you are anxious about, that you are worried about this morning, come from desires that are probably okay, but it's the threat against those desires that causes us to fear. I don't know if I'm going to get that. I don't know if I will be secure. I don't know if my kids are going to choose to follow Jesus. I don't know if I'm going to keep my job. I don't know if my health is going to hold up. I don't know if we're going to have enough money. In fact, it looks like we may not have enough money to end up the month. And all of a sudden, those desires are threatened and fear blossoms. Now, here's the weird part, okay? Fear comes when those desires are threatened. But we can be bold and fearful at the same time. Because most of you, if I had this conversation, you'd say, I'm not a fearful person. I'm a bold person. Do you understand that Saul was an incredibly bold and valiant man? He was called a warrior. I mean, this guy would go into battle, and it wasn't battle like today, you know, where you get to shoot someone from 100 yards away. This was face-to-face. This was intimate. This was one-on-one. This was in arm's reach of the people you killed. And that's what Saul did. So he was not a scaredy cat. This guy was a big guy who could get into war. He could fight. He was bold. And yet his greatest disobedience was driven by fear. We sometimes picture fearful people as being fearful people and bold people being bold people. It's just not true. Because you might have total confidence in the security of your job, your ability there, and still be fearful about what people think. You might be willing to boldly lead other people, but be fearful about a loss of control, right? Both can be true at the same time. This is why it's so deceptive to us, because we're like, well, I'm not fearful. Well, hold on a second. You might not be fearful here, but what about here? And guess which part God is really interested in? He wants to grow us here. Fear is connected to the significant desires. The desires themselves aren't the problem. It's when they're threatened that we begin to be fearful. And we can be fearful and bold at the same time. So what do we do with that? Well, here's the thing. Unprocessed fears is what hinders inner transformation. Remember, that's what we talked about. Inner transformation is what we're after. And I got to tell you, the worst advice you can tell someone who is worried, don't worry about it. Anybody ever told you that? You're like, that is unhelpful, right? Don't be, just don't be scared. Okay, well, that isn't entirely useful. Although, it's interesting that if you go through scriptures, what's the number one command when God interacts with people? You know what it is? Fear not. Don't be afraid. We're like, hold on, well, that's what God did. But here's the difference. We just spout it as kind of a thing. Whenever God encountered this, it was always in the context of, I want you to not be fearful because I want you to go do this thing. I want you to act on this. I want you to move. I want you to do something. This is not about, in other words, when God's telling you do not fear, it's not an emotional command. He's not saying, well, just stop feeling afraid. That's not what God's talking about. And yet that's what people tell us. Well, just don't feel that way. Well, I feel scared. Well, don't feel that way. Well, I lay in bed worried. Well, don't feel that way. That's not what God's talking about. And Saul's problem was that his fear dictated his emotions. Right? That's the problem. So when we go through this whole story, it's actually the actions, not the feelings, that hinders our transformation. Because when we fear, it changes what we do, if we let it. Take a look at how this impacted Saul in this story. Because he was fearful, he had selective obedience. Right? Saul said, well, I did kill everything. I did everything I was supposed to, but, they spared the best to give to God. So do you see what he's doing? Yeah, I listened. I did what I was supposed to do. Kinda. Mostly. 90%. We do this all the time when we're fearful. I'm fearful. I'm anxious about this. You know what? I'm anxious, so I'm going to do that, but I'm not really going to do the whole thing. And you know where we see this? This happens in a couple places, at least has in my life. One's with money. God says, be generous. I'll never forget a story where God's saying, look, someone came up, they had a need, and God said, we need you to give X thousands of dollars. And I thought, ooh, that's a lot. You know what, God? I'm going to be obedient, but I'm only going to give this much. Yeah, God didn't leave us alone until we rectified that situation, okay? Or it's when you're with your neighbor. Hey, you know what? I need to talk to my neighbor about Jesus. And you feel this really strong compulsion, and you go over there and you're like, at the end of the conversation, you're like, well, I didn't really talk about God. I didn't really say anything, but we were really friendly. Selective obedience. We do it all the time because we are fearful. I wonder how at times we mostly obey because we're fearful. Here's the second one. He rationalized. He rationalized his choices. He spins his selective disobedience, or his selective obedience. He says, the soldiers took sheep and cattle from the best, but we did it because we were going to do it for God. We were bringing this back so we could sacrifice. In other words, yeah, I didn't do what I was supposed to, but there was a really good reason behind it. Yeah, I know I'm supposed to forgive, but if I do that, they're never going to learn their lesson. Yeah, I know I'm supposed to go to that place, but you know what? If I do, I'm going to leave my kids at home. That's really not helpful for them, so you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm not actually going to do all these things over here with my money that God wanted me to do because really, I'm trying to be responsible for my retirement, my future. Right? We rationalize our selective obedience because we are fearful. I have a good reason for acting on my fear. This is real. Right? I am fearful for my kids right now, so you know what? I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And it makes total sense because, man, I got to watch out for my kids, and I'm the guardian. I'm not going to do this. God's like, well, then you're not obeying. I'm dating this non-Christian guy because I'm going to win him into the kingdom. Yeah. Here's number 3. We begin to blame other people. Did you see what Saul did? And did you see how fast Saul went when Samuel showed up? You know what he did? He said, I obeyed God. I did the mission. Look at me. And when Samuel said, then why do I hear sheep and cattle? And you know what he said? They made me do it. Did you notice how fast he did that? Look at me, look at me, look what I did. You didn't obey. It's not my fault, it's them. They did it. Look, the soldiers took the sheep and the cattle. They did it. It was on them. It's their fault. He didn't own anything. He blamed other people. I wanted to do right, honestly, Samuel, but the issue really was your command was pretty harsh, and they didn't want to follow it. I wonder how many times we do this. Yeah, I know God says I'm supposed to apologize, but you don't know what they did to me. You weren't there. You don't understand my story. If the government wasn't so messed up, then I would be more willing to follow the rules. If God actually gave me more blessings, I would be more generous. This is on you, God. You should have given me more stuff. And you laugh, except that's exactly what we do. We just never say it out loud because it sounds terrible, right? If you find yourself making excuses for your choices or feeling defensive about your choices, maybe it's time to take a second look. And we begin to pursue our own solutions and not God's. Saul was so worried about the men that he took things into his own hands because he wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to feel secure. He wanted to have the men like him. And so he did what was right in front of him to do. It was probably logical. Honestly, it probably made sense in the moment. And if we were to stick ourselves, it's very easy to point fingers. But how many of us, if we were in the same place as Saul, would have said, yeah, I probably would have done the same thing. See, there's nothing inherently wrong with feeling scared or being afraid. What's sinful is living that way and then making decisions that are based on us instead of on God. And it's a sin, not a preference. I'm not talking about those decisions that are obvious, like, okay, I'm not going to stick my hand in the fire because I don't want to get it burnt. No, it's not that. It's those decisions you make that run counter, right? Where God wants to do a work in us, and He wants to soften us up. He wants to help us know Him better. He is calling us into that relationship. To be more humble, to submit more often, to be bolder. And when we act out of fear, we are stopping the very thing that God wants to do in our lives. And often the very thing you wish you had the most. And me. So what do we do? Because you cannot look in the life of Saul and find a solution to this problem. Because he never conquered this. He never had inner transformation. In fact, if you go through his entire life, this was the pattern of his living. Because we have to actually deal with fear by practicing trust. Just look at the life of Saul. When facing Goliath, we read this: Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Not just the Israelites, but the king. Terrified. That's when they Goliath. Then a little bit later, we see this when David, beats Goliath and starts to become more popular. We read Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David. A little later, we see again, when Saul saw how successful David was, he was afraid of him. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and his daughter Michal loved David, in other words, my daughter fell in love with this guy who's really popular, he became still more afraid of him. And it drove him to be his enemy for the rest of his days. When his own son Jonathan became best friends with David, Saul acted in fear because he said, this kingdom is supposed to be yours. Don't you know what's going on? It's going to go to David. It's supposed to go to you. And each time Saul hit a point where he could have let go of his fear and act out of trust, he failed. Every time. Living out of fear is a practiced behavior. Do you know that? When we live fearfully, when we won't say something, when we won't speak up, when we worry about our children, when we worry about this, when we're consumed with what could happen, that's a practiced behavior. It's a result of repetition, repetition, repetition. I'm worried, I'm worried, I'm worried, I'm worried. I'm worried, I'm worried, I'm worried. Oh, I can't do that because if I do that, this is going to happen, so I'm going to act like this. And we repeat it over and over and over again, and we become worried, anxious, timid, fearful people. The cool part about that is learning to act out of trust is also a practiced behavior. Inner transformation, keeping fear from derailing us is something we do. It was interesting. I had a texting conversation this week with someone in our church about this whole idea of, what inner transformation versus, acting in power. One feels passive and one feels active. Do you understand that inner transformation is not passive? That's not us saying, oh God, please change me on the inside, and then just kind of waiting for him to do something. Inner transformation is the least passive project you will ever take in your life, because it requires engaging with every part of you, saying, okay, God, this is what I feel, but I know that I not do that. This is what I'm going to do. Unfortunately, Saul let the emotions drive his accomplishments. The tale of Saul is a story of an anointed, empowered, chosen man who, among other things, let fear set the narrative for his life. And it led him to manipulate others, try and control the circumstances, disobey what he knew to be right. It wrecked his relationships. It damaged his family. It damaged the nation. And it led to his removal as king. And his entire story is a story that could be said, if only he could have. I do not want to live a life that at the end says, oh, if I could have only. So here's 3 questions that I want you to consider, and you can take a snapshot of the screen. I'll leave it up for a minute, that hopefully will help you process a message like this. Here's the first. In what area of your life is worry, anxiety, and or fear influencing your decisions? And you have to be honest with yourself, because the surface answer always sounds good, just like Saul's. I just did it because we're sacrificing to God. I'm just doing this because I want to see my kids come to Jesus. I'm just doing this because I want to be smart and wise and prudent with my money. I want to do this because I'm just trying to build relationships. Don't want to turn them off by talking about Jesus. We always have these surface reasons that sound good. But where do you find fear and worry and anxiety actually changing what you do or influencing what you do? You know how you can tell that too? Is when I come and ask you to do something and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. Right? Hey, can you do this? Oh, I don't speak in front of people. Oh, I don't want to lead. Every time that happens, I should pull this up and say, remember? Because if I have to be up here being scared every week, so should you. No, I'm kidding. It's fine. Okay? What area of your life is worry, anxiety, or fear influencing your decisions? That's number 2. What are you afraid might happen if this significant desire is not met? This really helps you flesh it out, because we don't play this game very often. Not really. Because the question is, I keep coming back to some of these same examples because they seem to be so prominent. I'm fearful for my children. Okay. What do you think is going to happen here if this doesn't happen? Like, walk yourself through the fear, because our fears, as long as they remain nebulous and fuzzy, will dominate us. There's kind of this walking through, okay, if I say this to my neighbor, or if I'm talking to my friend and I mention Jesus, what's my fear? What's the actual fear? What am I fearful is going to happen? I'm fearful that they're going to laugh at me, that they're going to point to me, that they're going to make fun of me, that they're never going to talk to me again. I'm fearful of something, right? There's something underneath there. Put some words to it and say, okay, I'm fearful that if I actually gave 10% of my income, I would have to sell my house because I couldn't pay my bills. Like, what's the fear? What's actually going on underneath? That's number 2. Another one, the last one is, how are you feeling then the desire to control and not trust in that area? In other words, you see there's a progression here, right? Where's fear influencing my decisions? What's the actual fear that's going on? What do I think will happen? And now what am I doing to try and grab control of this to make sure that that thing I think might happen won't happen? And you cannot do this in 3 minutes. This is going to require some thought. And if you're struggling with this, ask the Holy Spirit to reveal it in your life. He would be delighted to help you. Because the other side of this is inner transformation and boldness and courage and not having to worry anymore. That's what He wants for you. That's what He wants for me. If we are truly pursuing inner transformation, it is a lifelong journey. It just is. It'll never stop. I'm 53 years old, And I feel like I know less today than I've ever known in my life. Sometimes I wonder what is going on. And I step back and I go, that's because God is still at work. And I am so grateful that He is. But if instead of inner transformation, you want a God who's your butler to call on to fix things that aren't right, instead of a God who has full access to your life, you're going to be disappointed. But if you want a God who has full access, it's going to mean calling out, naming, and recognizing your fears, your anxieties, your worries. And then saying, okay, God, how do I practice living in trust in this area? Communion actually is a marvelous way for us to deal with this today. Jesus came and He lived among us, and He gave up His life because He loved us so much. And He demonstrated in His life and His death that He can be fully, completely, and in every way trusted. With every part of your life, in every place that you're fearful, He can be trusted. And when He leads you and challenges you, it's always for your good and my good. That's what He is. He showed it. He's proved it. What we get to celebrate this morning is that we don't have to second guess His goodness or wonder if He's in control.